They called her crazy for insisting on the old AV-8B Harrier, laughing behind her back as she prepped the ancient jump jet while they climbed into their sleek F-35s. But when the distress call came from Grid Charlie 7, a mountainous hellscape where no conventional aircraft could land, Captain Sarah Phoenix Chen would prove that sometimes the oldest bird in the sky is exactly what you need to reach the unreachable. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The pre-dawn air at Marine Corps Air Station Yuma crackled with the familiar tension of another training sortie. Captain Sarah Chen adjusted her flight helmet and ran through her final pre-flight checklist, her gloved hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed this ritual thousands of times. Around her, the flight line buzzed with the controlled chaos of military aviation, ground crews scurrying between aircraft, the whine of jet engines spinning up, radio chatter cutting through the desert morning like electronic lightning. Sarah's AV-8B Harrier II sat squat and ungainly on the tarmac, its angular frame and distinctive engine nozzles making it look like a mechanical bulldog among greyhounds. The aircraft bore the scars of decades of service. Paint worn thin in places, panel joints that didn't quite align perfectly, the overall appearance of a machine that had seen too many combat zones and too many hard landings. To most of the younger pilots on base, it looked like a museum piece that should have been retired years ago. Still flying that antique, Chen? The voice belonged to Major Brad Viper Richardson. Call sign earned more through his personality than his flying skills. He strutted across the flight line in his perfectly pressed flight suit, aviator sunglasses catching the early morning light as he gestured dismissively towards Sarah's aircraft. Behind him trailed his usual entourage of junior officers who laughed at his jokes whether they were funny or not, and today was no exception. Sarah didn't look up from her checklist. She'd learned long ago that engaging with Richardson's commentary was like feeding a stray cat. It only encouraged more of the same behavior. The Harrier's maintenance log showed green across the board. Hydraulic pressure nominal. Vertical lift system functioning within parameters. Everything that mattered was working perfectly, regardless of what the aircraft looked like to casual observers. "I heard they're finally going to ground those rust buckets next month," Richardson continued, warming to his theme. His voice carried just enough to ensure the ground crew and nearby pilots could hear every word. About time, if you ask me. That thing's older than some of the enlisted personnel working on it. Hell, it's probably older than you, Chen. The ground crew chief, Staff Sergeant Martinez, shot Richardson a look that could have melted steel. Martinez had been working on Harriers for 15 years, and his weathered hands could diagnose problems that computer diagnostics missed. He'd seen pilots come and go, watched as shiny new aircraft replaced reliable workhorses, and he'd learned to tell the difference between pilots who understood their machines and pilots who just happened to sit in the cockpit. "This bird's got more combat hours than half the F-35s on this base," Martinez said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who actually knew what he was talking about. "And she lands where others can't." Richardson's laugh had the hollow ring of someone who'd never had to put his skills to a real test. "Yeah, if by lands you mean crashes in slow motion. When's the last time anyone actually needed to vertical land in combat?" "This isn't the Falklands, Martinez. It's 2023. We've got precision munitions and standoff capability. Who needs to hover like a helicopter when you can strike from 50 miles out?" Sarah finally looked up from her checklist, her dark eyes meeting Richardson's reflected gaze in his mirrored sunglasses. She was 32 years old, with the kind of quiet intensity that came from 6 years of flying the Harrier in every conceivable condition. Her flight suit bore no flashy patches or ego-stroking call signs, just the simple name tape that read Chen S. and the wings that she'd earned the hard way. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "getting there matters more than looking good while you do it." The comment hit its target. Richardson's practiced smirk flickered for just a moment, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like uncertainty. Because while he'd spent the last 3 years flying training missions and airshow demonstrations, Sarah Chen had been flying real missions in real places, where making mistakes meant people didn't come home. She'd earned her call sign Phoenix, not through some clever wordplay or memorable incident, but through the simple fact that she had a tendency to emerge from situations that should have been unsurvivable. Shot up over Syria and still managing to limp home on one engine. Emergency landing in a sandstorm that had grounded every other aircraft in the squadron. 3 separate instances of mechanical failure that would have killed lesser pilots, but Sarah had brought her bird home every time. The thing about the Harrier that most pilots never understood was that it wasn't just an aircraft, it was a philosophy. While other jets were designed to go fast and straight, the Harrier was built to go anywhere, land anywhere, and operate from anywhere. It could take off from a road, land in a parking lot, hover over a building, or touch down vertically in a space barely larger than a tennis court. In the right hands, it was the most versatile combat aircraft ever built. In the wrong hands, it was a barely controlled death trap. Richardson and his followers moved on to their sleek F-35s, the newest generation of stealth fighters that represented the cutting edge of military aviation technology. The F-35 was everything the Harrier wasn't: fast, modern, sophisticated, and expensive. It could penetrate enemy airspace undetected, deliver precision strikes from beyond visual range, and return to base without ever being seen. It was the kind of aircraft that made military contractors rich and Pentagon generals feel important. It was also the kind of aircraft that needed a pristine runway, perfect weather conditions, and a support crew that could stock a small city. The F-35 was brilliant at what it was designed to do, but what it was designed to do was fight the kind of clean, high-tech war that existed primarily in PowerPoint presentations and defense contractor brochures. Real war, Sarah had learned, was messier than that. She finished her pre-flight inspection with the thorough attention to detail that had kept her alive through 6 years of flying the Harrier. Every control surface, every access panel, every piece of equipment that could mean the difference between a successful mission and a smoking crater in the desert. The aircraft might look old and ungainly, but every system had been maintained to perfection by ground crews who understood that appearances could be deceiving. The morning flight schedule called for basic air-to-ground training, practicing the kind of close air support missions that had been the Harrier's bread and butter for decades. While the F-35 pilots would be running simulated strikes against fixed targets from comfortable distances, Sarah would be practicing the kind of low-level, high-risk flying that put aircraft and pilot in direct contact with the chaos of ground combat. It was dangerous work that required split-second timing, perfect coordination with ground forces, and the kind of flying skills that couldn't be taught in a simulator. The margin for error was measured in feet rather than miles, and the consequences of mistakes were immediate and final. It was exactly the kind of flying that the newer generation of pilots preferred to avoid, delegating it to unmanned drones whenever possible. But Sarah had volunteered for every close air support mission available, learning to read the battlefield from the cockpit, understanding the rhythm of ground combat, developing the instinctive feel for terrain and weather that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. She'd flown support missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and half a dozen other places that didn't officially exist in Pentagon briefings. She'd learned to land on highways under fire, take off from bomb-damaged runways, and operate from forward bases that consisted of little more than a flat piece of desert and a fuel truck. She'd mastered the art of vertical landing not as a party trick, but as a survival skill that had saved her life, and the lives of countless ground personnel who needed someone crazy enough to land in places where conventional aircraft couldn't go. The other pilots saw an outdated aircraft flown by someone who refused to adapt to modern warfare. What they missed was that Sarah Chen had turned herself into something far more dangerous than any single piece of technology. She'd become a pilot who could make the impossible routine and the routine extraordinary. As she climbed into the cockpit and began the engine start sequence, Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Every flight was an opportunity to perfect her skills, to push the boundaries of what was possible, to prepare for the moment when someone, somewhere, would need her to do something that couldn't be done by anyone else. She had no way of knowing that moment was less than 4 hours away. The Harrier's Pegasus engine came to life with a sound like controlled thunder, the aircraft's entire frame vibrating with barely contained power. Sarah ran through her systems checks one final time, confirming that every piece of equipment was functioning within normal parameters. The aircraft was ready, the pilot was ready. The only question was whether the world was ready for what Sarah Chen could do when everything depended on her ability to put her aircraft exactly where it needed to be, regardless of what conventional wisdom said was possible. In the distance, Richardson's F-35 lifted off with the smooth acceleration of advanced technology and unlimited funding. It climbed quickly into the morning sky, disappearing into the blue with the effortless grace of a machine designed to dominate its environment through superior capability and overwhelming force. Sarah's Harrier followed a different path. It rose more slowly, with the deliberate purpose of an aircraft that had learned to succeed through adaptability rather than raw power. As it gained altitude, the ungainly shape began to make sense, the angular lines and distinctive nozzles revealing themselves as the product of engineering that prioritized function over form, capability over appearance. By the time both aircraft had disappeared into the desert morning, the difference between them was already becoming clear. One was built to fight the war that planners expected. The other was built to win the war that actually happened. The first indication that this would be different from any routine training mission came at 0847 hours, when Colonel Jennifer Hayes burst through the doors of the operations center with the kind of urgency that made everyone in the room stop what they were doing and pay attention. Hayes was not the type of commanding officer who raised her voice or created drama unnecessarily. When she moved with purpose, it meant something significant was happening somewhere in the world that required immediate attention from people who flew fast jets for a living. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a real-world emergency developing in Sector 7 Alpha," Hayes announced, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of radio chatter and computer terminals. "I need all available pilots in the briefing room in 5 minutes. This is not a drill." The operations center transformed instantly from the relaxed atmosphere of routine training into the focused energy of actual military operations. Coffee cups were abandoned, conversations cut short, and personnel began moving with the urgent efficiency that characterized military units when lives hung in the balance. The large display screens that had been showing weather patterns and training schedules now flickered to tactical maps and satellite imagery. Sarah was still 40 minutes into her training flight when the recall order crackled through her radio. "Phoenix, control. Return to base immediately for priority tasking. Authentication code Bravo 77-Charlie. The radio operator's voice carried the clipped precision that meant this was serious business, not another training exercise designed to test reaction times and communication procedures. "Control, Phoenix. Confirm immediate return for priority tasking. Estimate 20 minutes to touchdown." Sarah banked the Harrier into a wide turn, abandoning the practice bombing run she'd been setting up. Through her canopy, she could see Richardson's F-35 also changing course, the sleek fighter leaving a contrail as it accelerated toward home base. The flight back to Yuma passed in tense silence, both pilots monitoring radio frequencies for any additional information about what had prompted the emergency recall. Military aviation was full of false alarms and routine emergencies that turned out to be administrative problems rather than genuine crises. But something about the tone and timing of this recall felt different. By the time Sarah had landed and was shutting down her systems, the flight line had taken on the purposeful chaos of real-world operations. Ground crews were already preparing aircraft for rapid turnaround, fuel trucks positioning themselves near hardstands, and weapons personnel checking inventories with the kind of urgency that suggested someone, somewhere, was in serious trouble. The briefing room was packed with every available pilot, their flight suits still damp with perspiration from recent flights. Colonel Hayes stood at the front of the room beside a large tactical display that showed a mountainous region marked with red symbols indicating hostile activity. The satellite imagery revealed terrain so rugged and inhospitable that it looked more like the surface of another planet than anywhere humans should reasonably be expected to operate. "Gentleman and lady," Hayes began, nodding toward Sarah. 47 minutes ago, a Special Operations Reconnaissance Team designated Razor 41 went dark during a surveillance mission in the Zagros Mountains of eastern Iran. Their last transmission indicated they were under heavy fire and had sustained casualties. The team consists of 4 personnel conducting intelligence gathering on suspected nuclear facility construction in the region. The room went completely silent. Iran. Nuclear facilities. Special operations personnel under fire and cut off from support. These were the ingredients of international incidents and potential wars. The kind of situation that transformed routine military service into history book material. Hayes clicked to the next slide, revealing a 3-dimensional terrain map that made the difficulties immediately apparent. "The reconnaissance team is located here," she pointed to a red dot surrounded by towering peaks and narrow valleys. "Approximately 87 kilometers inside Iranian airspace, at an elevation of 8,000 feet above sea level. The terrain consists of near-vertical mountain faces, narrow ridges, and valleys so constricted that conventional helicopter operations are impossible. She clicked again, showing weather data that made the situation even worse. Current conditions in the area include high winds, intermittent cloud cover, and temperature variations that range from 20 degrees below freezing at altitude to over 90 degrees in the valleys. Local air defense assets include mobile SAM sites and fighter aircraft based approximately 40 minutes flight time from the target area. Major Richardson raised his hand. "Ma'am, what's our mission profile? Are we looking at a strike package to suppress air defenses? Or coordinated search and rescue operations?" His question carried the assumption that this would be handled through conventional means: multiple aircraft, overwhelming force, and the kind of complex operation that required days of planning and coordination. Colonel Hayes's expression suggested that conventional solutions were not going to be adequate for this particular problem. The mission parameters are constrained by several factors that limit our options significantly. First, this is a black operation. There can be no official acknowledgement of American personnel operating in Iranian territory. Second, the window for extraction is extremely narrow due to weather patterns and enemy response times. Third, and most critically, the terrain makes conventional helicopter assault impossible, and fixed-wing aircraft cannot operate in the confined spaces where the team is located. She clicked to aerial photographs that showed the specific area where Razor 41 had gone silent. The images revealed a landscape that looked like it had been designed specifically to prevent aircraft operations. Jagged peaks that rose thousands of feet above narrow valleys, ridgelines that barely provided room for a single vehicle, and slopes so steep that helicopter landing would be suicidal even in perfect weather conditions. The reconnaissance team is trapped on a narrow shelf approximately 30 feet wide and 100 feet long, surrounded by vertical drops on 3 sides. Conventional rotorcraft cannot reach this location due to altitude, wind conditions, and the confined space available for rotor clearance. The team has medical emergencies that require immediate evacuation, but standard rescue procedures are not viable given the operational environment. Sarah studied the photographs with the experienced eye of someone who had learned to read terrain from a pilot's perspective. The location was indeed impossible for conventional aircraft, too high for most helicopters to operate effectively, too confined for normal landing procedures, surrounded by terrain that would create deadly wind shear and turbulence. It was exactly the kind of place where people got stranded because no one could figure out how to reach them. But as she examined the images more closely, Sarah began to see possibilities that others might miss. The shelf where the team was trapped was narrow, but it was flat. The surrounding peaks would create turbulence, but they would also provide wind breaks if approached from the correct angle. The elevation was high, but not beyond the operational ceiling of a properly configured aircraft flown by someone who understood mountain flying. Most importantly, the space available for landing was tight, but it was just large enough for an aircraft that didn't need a runway, an aircraft that could descend vertically, hover in a confined space, and touch down in an area barely larger than a basketball court. On it, Richardson was already voicing what most of the room was thinking. "Ma'am, this sounds like a job for special operations helicopters. The 160th SOAR has birds specifically designed for high-altitude, confined area operations. Why are we being briefed on what appears to be a helicopter mission?" Hayes's expression grew grim. "Because the 160th has already attempted the mission, twice. Both attempts were aborted due to aircraft limitations and environmental conditions. The first helicopter reached the general area but could not descend to the team's location due to rotor clearance issues and wind conditions. The second attempt resulted in an emergency landing when severe turbulence damaged the aircraft's hydraulic systems." The room absorbed this information in stunned silence. If the Army's premier special operations helicopter unit couldn't reach the stranded personnel, then the situation was even more desperate than it had initially appeared. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment represented the absolute pinnacle of rotorcraft capability, with pilots and aircraft specifically trained for exactly this type of impossible mission. "The reconnaissance team has been on the ground for over 8 hours, Hayes continued. They have limited supplies, at least one serious casualty, and intelligence indicates that Iranian search teams are actively hunting for them. Weather conditions are deteriorating, and we have perhaps 6 hours of usable flying conditions remaining before the next storm system moves through the area." She paused, letting the implications sink in. 4 American Special Operations personnel were trapped in impossible terrain, surrounded by hostile forces, with time running out and conventional rescue methods already proven inadequate. Someone in that room was going to be asked to attempt something that expert helicopter pilots had declared impossible. "This brings us to an unconventional solution," Hayes said, her voice carrying the weight of decisions that would affect multiple lives and potentially international relations. "Analysis of the landing site indicates that a fixed-wing aircraft capable of vertical landing might be able to reach the team's location. The space is too confined for helicopters, but an aircraft with vertical takeoff and landing capability might be able to descend directly onto the shelf and extract the personnel." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. In the entire Marine Corps inventory, there was only one fixed-wing aircraft capable of vertical landing operations. The same aircraft that Richardson and his colleagues dismissed as an obsolete relic. The same aircraft that she had spent 6 years learning to fly in conditions that would challenge the limits of both machine and pilot. Richardson's hand shot up again. "Ma'am, are we seriously considering sending a Harrier into Iranian airspace for a special operations extraction? That's not what the aircraft was designed for." "The Harrier is an attack aircraft, not a personnel recovery platform." Hayes turned to look directly at Sarah. "Captain Chen, in your professional opinion, could an AV-8B Harrier reach the location where Razor 4-1 is trapped and successfully extract personnel from a confined landing site at 8,000 feet elevation in high wind conditions?" Every eye in the room turned towards Sarah. This was the moment when theoretical discussions became life-and-death decisions. When years of training and experience crystallized into a simple yes or no answer that would determine whether 4 Americans came home alive or died on a mountainside in Iran. Sarah looked at the aerial photographs again, this time not as an academic exercise but as an operational problem that required an immediate solution. The landing site was challenging but not impossible. The altitude was high, but within the Harrier's operational envelope. The wind conditions were dangerous but manageable, with proper approach techniques. The political implications were enormous, but that wasn't her concern. Her concern was whether she could put her aircraft down in a space the size of a tennis court, at 8,000 feet above sea level, in hostile territory, and get it back out again with 4 additional people on board. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said quietly. "It can be done." The silence that followed Sarah's quiet confirmation stretched for several seconds, broken only by the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of jet engines on the flight line. Richardson's expression had shifted from skeptical amusement to something approaching genuine concern, while the other pilots exchanged glances that mixed doubt with a growing realization that they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Ardhead." Colonel Hayes nodded once, a gesture that carried the weight of command decisions made under impossible circumstances. "Captain Chen, I need you to understand the implications of what you're volunteering for. This mission will take place in hostile airspace, with no official support, no backup, and no possibility of rescue if something goes wrong. If you're shot down, captured, or killed, the United States will deny any knowledge of your presence in Iranian territory." Sarah met the colonel's gaze without flinching. She'd known the moment Hayes mentioned Iran that any pilot who took this mission would be operating completely outside the protection of official channels. Deniable operations were part of military reality, but they were usually handled by personnel who'd specifically volunteered for that kind of work. Combat pilots typically operated under the assumption that their government would move heaven and earth to bring them home if things went wrong. Furthermore, Hayes continued, the technical challenges of this mission exceed anything in current training protocols. You'll be attempting a vertical landing at an altitude that pushes your aircraft's performance envelope in weather conditions that have already defeated helicopter pilots with extensive mountain experience, in a confined space that provides no margin for error. One mistake means the loss of your aircraft, your life, and the lives of 4 special operations personnel. Major Richardson couldn't contain himself any longer. "Colonel, with all due respect, this is insane. We're talking about sending one pilot in an obsolete aircraft to attempt something that trained special operations helicopter crews couldn't accomplish. The Harrier wasn't designed for personnel extraction missions. It doesn't have the payload capacity, the endurance, or the specialized equipment required for this type of operation." Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, the squadron's operations officer, leaned forward in his chair. Webb had been flying Harriers for 15 years and understood their capabilities better than almost anyone in the room. Brad's got a point about payload limitations. Sarah, a standard AV-8B has a maximum takeoff weight that leaves very little margin for additional personnel. 4 special operations troops with their equipment could easily exceed your safe operating limits. Sarah had already been running calculations in her head since Hayes had first described the mission parameters. Weight and balance were critical factors in vertical landing operations, especially at high altitude, where engine performance was reduced and air density worked against lift generation. But she'd also spent years learning to push the Harrier's envelope in ways that existed outside normal operating procedures. The reconnaissance team will have abandoned most of their heavy equipment by now, she said, thinking through the practical realities of personnel under fire. 4 operators in basic gear, maybe 200 pounds each maximum. Total additional weight of 800 pounds, well within acceptable parameters for short-distance vertical operations. She stood and moved toward the tactical display, her finger tracing the route from their current position to the target area. Range to target is 420 nautical miles. Normal mission profile would require aerial refueling, but if we strip the aircraft to minimum configuration and load maximum internal fuel, it's possible to reach the target area and return to a forward refueling point without tanker support. Richardson shook his head. You're talking about flying a combat mission with no weapons, no defensive systems, and barely enough fuel to make it home. What happens if you encounter Iranian air defense assets? What happens if their fighters intercept you before you reach the target? The question exposed the central dilemma of the entire operation. Success depended on stealth, timing, and a level of piloting skill that existed at the very edge of human and mechanical capability. Any one of dozens of factors could turn the mission into a catastrophic failure that would result in the loss of American personnel and potentially trigger an international incident. But Sarah had been thinking about those factors since the moment she'd seen the aerial photographs. The mission profile takes advantage of terrain masking and known gaps in Iranian radar coverage. Ingress route follows valley systems that provide natural concealment from ground-based sensors. Time over target minimized to reduce exposure to air defense assets. Emergency escape routes identified for multiple contingencies. She turned to face the room, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had studied every aspect of the problem and found viable solutions. The real challenge isn't avoiding detection, it's the landing itself. Vertical descent into a confined area at high altitude, in wind conditions that will create severe turbulence, with no opportunity for wave-off or go-around. Once we're committed to the approach, we're committed to the landing. Colonel Hayes was watching Sarah with the calculating expression of a commander trying to balance impossible risks against unacceptable alternatives. Walk me through the technical requirements for this type of landing. I need to understand exactly what we're asking you to attempt. Sarah moved to a whiteboard and began sketching the approach profile, her hand moving with the practiced precision of someone who'd visualized this type of operation countless times. Normal vertical landing procedures assume a clear area with adequate space for lateral drift correction. This landing site provides approximately 30 feet of width, which eliminates any possibility of lateral movement during descent. She drew lines indicating wind patterns and terrain features, showing how the surrounding peaks would create turbulence and downdrafts that could slam an aircraft into the mountain without warning. Descending air currents off the ridge faces will create a vertical wind shear environment that changes unpredictably. Approach must be absolutely vertical to avoid contact with terrain features. The technical complexity of what she was describing became clear as she added more details to the diagram. This wasn't just a challenging landing, it was an aeronautical feat that pushed both aircraft and pilot to the very limits of performance. The margin for error was measured in inches rather than feet, with consequences that were immediately fatal for any mistake. Engine power requirements for vertical landing at 8,000 feet elevation exceed normal parameters due to reduced air density, she continued, adding thrust calculations to the diagram. Available power margin is minimal, which means payload restrictions are absolute. Cannot exceed maximum certified weight under any circumstances. Lieutenant Thompson, one of the newer Harrier pilots, raised his hand tentatively. Sarah, have you ever actually performed a landing like this? I mean, under actual operational conditions rather than training scenarios? His question carried the weight of someone who understood that simulator experience and real-world execution were very different things. Sarah turned from the whiteboard, and for the first time since the briefing had begun, she allowed a slight smile to cross her face. Afghanistan, 2019. Forward Operating Base Schenck took mortar fire that cratered the runway and damaged the helicopter landing zone. Marine reconnaissance team was trapped on an observation post with a wounded operator who needed immediate medical evacuation. She paused, remembering the mission that had earned her the call sign Phoenix, and taught her that textbook procedures sometimes weren't adequate for real-world situations. Landing site was a flat section of ridgeline approximately 40 feet wide, altitude 6,000 feet, high winds, enemy forces within small arms range. Successful extraction of 4 personnel, including 1 casualty. The room was completely silent now, everyone understanding that they weren't listening to theoretical discussion, but to operational experience that directly applied to the current situation. Sarah had already done something very similar to what this mission required, under combat conditions, with lives hanging in the balance. Colonel Hayes leaned back in her chair, processing this information. What was the outcome of that mission? All personnel successfully evacuated to medical facility. Wounded operator made full recovery. No damage to aircraft or additional casualties. Sarah's voice carried no pride or boastfulness, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting technical data. But Richardson wasn't finished with his objections. That was Afghanistan, not Iran. Afghan airspace with coalition air superiority and friendly forces providing support. This mission takes place in hostile territory, with no backup and no support. The political ramifications if you're captured or killed are enormous. Hayes stood up, her expression indicating that the time for debate was ending and the time for decisions had arrived. Captain Chen, I'm going to ask you one final time. Are you willing and able to attempt this mission, understanding all the risks and limitations we've discussed? Sarah looked around the room at the faces of her fellow pilots, seeing mixtures of concern, doubt, and reluctant admiration. These were good people who genuinely cared about her welfare and understood the magnitude of what was being asked. Understood that 4 Americans were trapped in hostile territory with time running out and conventional rescue methods already proven inadequate. Yes, ma'am. I can bring them home. Hayes nodded once, the gesture sealing Sarah's fate and setting in motion a chain of events that would test everything she'd learned in 6 years of flying the Harrier. Very well, mission authorization approved. Launch window opens in 4 hours. Use that time to prepare your aircraft and finalize mission planning. As the room began to clear, Richardson approached Sarah with an expression that had lost all traces of his earlier mockery. Sarah, listen to me. I know we've had our differences about aircraft preferences, but I don't want to see you die trying to prove a point about the Harrier. This mission is beyond dangerous. It's borderline suicidal. Sarah was already gathering her flight materials, her mind shifting into the focused preparation mode that preceded every combat mission. Brad, 4 people are going to die if someone doesn't help them. I have the training, the aircraft, and the experience to reach them. Sometimes that's all that matters. She headed for the door, but Richardson's voice stopped her. And what if you don't make it back? What if this turns into an international incident that starts a war? Is saving 4 people worth risking the lives of thousands? Sarah turned back to face him, and for a moment, Richardson saw past the professional composure to the absolute certainty that drove her decisions. Those 4 people took an oath to serve their country, just like we did. They're trapped in hostile territory because they were doing their job. If we abandon them because the mission is difficult or politically inconvenient, then our oath doesn't mean anything. She left Richardson standing in the empty briefing room, already moving toward the flight line where her Harrier waited like a mechanical bird of prey, ungainly and obsolete to casual observers, but perfectly designed for the impossible mission that lay ahead. In 4 hours, Captain Sarah Phoenix Chen would discover whether her confidence in herself and her aircraft was justified, or whether she was about to become another casualty of war in a place where her government would deny she had ever existed. The next 3 hours transformed Sarah's routine aircraft into something that bore little resemblance to a standard AV-8B Harrier. Under the blazing Arizona sun, ground crew members swarmed over the aircraft like pit crew mechanics, removing every piece of equipment that wasn't absolutely essential for the mission ahead. External weapon pylons came off first, followed by the sophisticated targeting pods and electronic warfare systems that normally made the Harrier a formidable attack aircraft. Staff Sergeant Martinez supervised the modifications with the methodical precision of someone who understood that lives depended on getting every detail exactly right. His weathered hands moved over each component as it was removed, checking weights and ensuring that the aircraft's center of gravity remained within acceptable parameters. Years of experience had taught him that successful missions were built on attention to details that most people never noticed. "We're pulling everything non-essential," Martinez explained to the younger crew members who were learning to see their aircraft as more than just collections of sophisticated technology. Navigation lights, backup communications gear, auxiliary power systems, even the paint from non-critical surfaces. Every pound matters when you're operating at the edge of performance envelope. The fuel system modifications were the most complex part of the preparation. Maximum internal fuel load meant filling every available tank to absolute capacity, leaving no reserves for training margins or conservative flight planning. The additional fuel would provide just enough range to reach the target area and return to a forward refueling point, assuming perfect weather conditions and flawless navigation. Sarah worked alongside the ground crew, her pilot's knowledge of aircraft systems complementing their mechanical expertise. She understood the Harrier's fuel consumption patterns under various flight conditions, knew exactly how much reserve would be needed for the vertical landing sequence, and could calculate the precise moment when she would reach the point of no return. "Total fuel load gives us 530 miles of range under optimal conditions," she said, reviewing the calculations one final time. "Distance to target is 420 miles, which leaves 110 miles of reserve. Vertical landing and takeoff sequence will consume approximately 30 miles worth of fuel, leaving 80 miles margin for navigation errors or weather delays." The numbers were tight but manageable, assuming everything went according to plan, but Sarah had learned through hard experience that military operations rarely went according to plan, especially operations conducted in hostile territory under extreme weather conditions. The margin for error was razor-thin and getting smaller with every passing hour. Captain Lisa Torres, the squadron's intelligence officer, approached with a tablet displaying real-time satellite imagery and weather updates. Torres had been monitoring Iranian air defense patterns and communication intercepts, looking for any indication that the mission had been compromised or that enemy forces were preparing for unusual activity. "Latest intelligence update shows no change in Iranian air defense posture," Torres reported, scrolling through classified information that painted a picture of routine military operations rather than heightened alert status. "Their combat air patrols are following normal patterns, and we're not seeing any unusual ground-based radar activity in the target area." She swiped to weather information that was less encouraging. However, the meteorological situation is deteriorating faster than initially predicted. Wind speeds at the target elevation are increasing, and cloud cover is building along your ingress route. Visibility at the landing site may be severely limited by the time you arrive. Sarah studied the weather data with the focused attention of someone whose life would depend on understanding every nuance of atmospheric conditions. High winds meant increased turbulence during the critical vertical landing phase. Cloud cover would make navigation more difficult and reduce her ability to spot potential threats from Iranian air defense systems. Limited visibility would turn an already challenging landing into something approaching pure guesswork. But the weather also provided opportunities that a skilled pilot could exploit. Low clouds would conceal her aircraft from visual observation, making it harder for Iranian forces to track her approach. The same winds that would complicate landing would also create radar interference and make it difficult for ground-based sensors to maintain consistent contact. "Wind direction is actually favorable for the approach angle I've been planning," Sarah noted, pointing to specific data points that revealed patterns in the atmospheric turbulence. "If I time the descent correctly, the dominant wind pattern will help stabilize the aircraft during the critical final phase of landing." Martinez had moved to the aircraft's cockpit, where he was making final adjustments to systems that had been modified for this specific mission. The pilot's seat had been adjusted to accommodate additional survival gear. Emergency communications equipment had been installed in spaces normally reserved for weapon systems, and backup navigation aids had been added to compensate for the electronic warfare environment expected over Iranian territory. "We've installed additional oxygen generation capacity for high-altitude operations," Martinez explained as Sarah climbed into the cockpit to check the modifications. Also added emergency medical supplies and trauma kit in case any of the personnel you're extracting need immediate treatment during the flight home. The cockpit felt different with all the modifications, subtly altered in ways that required Sarah to adapt her normal procedures. Switch positions had changed, new equipment required different startup sequences, and the overall weight distribution of the aircraft would affect handling characteristics in ways that could only be fully understood once she was actually flying. Sarah ran through her checklist methodically, testing each system and confirming that all modifications had been properly integrated with existing aircraft functions. The Harrier was no longer a standard attack aircraft. It had been transformed into a specialized extraction platform optimized for one specific mission under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Vertical lift system is showing green across all parameters, she reported, checking the engine nozzles and reaction control systems that would be critical during the landing sequence. Thrust vectoring response is normal. Hover capabilities are within expected ranges for current aircraft weight. The clock on the instrument panel showed 2 hours until the launch window opened. Sarah used the remaining time to review every aspect of the mission profile, memorizing navigation waypoints, studying satellite imagery of the target area, and visualizing each phase of the operation, from takeoff to landing to extraction to return flight. Colonel Hayes appeared beside the aircraft as Sarah was completing her final systems check. The colonel's expression carried the weight of command decisions made under impossible circumstances, but also the confidence of someone who trusted her personnel to accomplish missions that exceeded normal expectations. Final intelligence update indicates that Razor 41 is still alive and in position at the target location, Hayes said, her voice carrying information that had traveled through classified channels from reconnaissance satellites and special operations communication networks. However, Iranian search teams are closing on their position. Time remaining for extraction is estimated at less than 6 hours. The timeline was getting tighter, adding another layer of pressure to an already complex mission. Sarah would have to reach the target area, locate the stranded personnel, execute a perfect vertical landing in confined space, load 4 additional people onto an aircraft already at maximum weight, and execute a perfect vertical takeoff before Iranian forces discovered their location. Weather at the target area continues to deteriorate, Hayes continued, reviewing information that painted an increasingly grim picture of the operational environment. Winds are gusting to 40 knots, cloud ceiling is dropping toward the landing site elevation, and visibility is decreasing rapidly. Conditions at the extraction point are approaching the limits of safe aircraft operation. Sarah absorbed this information without changing expression. She'd learned years ago that focusing on factors beyond her control was a waste of mental energy that could be better spent preparing for the challenges she could actually influence. Weather was what it was. Her job was to adapt her flying to whatever conditions existed when she reached the target area. "Ma'am, I'm ready to launch as soon as the window opens," Sarah said simply. Around her, the ground crew was completing final preparations, removing equipment that had been used for the modifications, and preparing the aircraft for immediate departure. Martinez approached with a clipboard that contained the final weight and balance calculations, fuel load verification, and system status report that officially certified the aircraft as ready for flight operations. His signature on the document represented years of experience and professional judgment, confirming that everything possible had been done to ensure mission success. "She's ready, Captain," Martinez said, his weathered face showing the kind of quiet pride that came from knowing that his work might save American lives. "Aircraft is configured for maximum range and payload flexibility. All systems are operating within normal parameters for the mission profile." He paused, looking at Sarah with the expression of someone who understood exactly what she was about to attempt. "Ma'am, I've been working on Harriers for 15 years, and I've never seen one configured for a mission like this. But if anyone can make it work, it's you." Sarah climbed down from the cockpit and shook Martinez's hand, a gesture that carried the weight of mutual respect between professionals who understood that successful missions required teamwork between aircrew and ground personnel. "Sergeant, if I bring this bird back in one piece, it'll be because you and your crew gave me the tools to do the job." The launch window was opening, and across the flight line, other aircraft were beginning their normal training operations. F-35s lifted off with their smooth acceleration and advanced technology, heading for routine exercises that would be completed safely and efficiently. Transport aircraft taxied toward runways that would take them to destinations where landing zones were prepared and weather conditions were acceptable. Sarah's mission was different. She would be flying alone into hostile territory to attempt something that expert helicopter pilots had declared impossible, betting her life and the lives of 4 special operations personnel on her ability to push an obsolete aircraft beyond its normal operational limits. As she walked toward her aircraft for the final time before launch, Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Somewhere in the mountains of Iran, 4 Americans were trapped and running out of time. Weather conditions were deteriorating, enemy forces were closing in, and conventional rescue methods had already failed. But Sarah Chin had spent 6 years learning to make the impossible routine, turning the Harrier into an extension of her own capabilities, mastering the art of vertical flight in conditions that would defeat lesser pilots. She'd trained for this moment without knowing it, preparing for a mission that would test everything she'd learned about flying, about courage, and about the promises that bound military personnel together regardless of the personal cost. The Harrier sat on the flight line like a mechanical predator, stripped of unnecessary equipment and loaded with maximum fuel, configured for a mission that existed at the very edge of what was technically possible. In 30 minutes, Sarah would discover whether her confidence was justified, or whether she was about to attempt something that would end in catastrophic failure. But as she performed her final walk-around inspection, checking each component one last time before committing to the mission, Sarah felt no doubt about her decision. 4 people needed help that only she could provide, using skills that only she possessed, flying an aircraft that only she truly understood. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it had to be. The Harrier's Pegasus engine spun to life with a sound that had become as familiar to Sarah as her own heartbeat, but this time the routine startup sequence carried the weight of a mission unlike any she had ever attempted. Every gauge, every system indicator, every vibration through the airframe told her that the aircraft was ready for what lay ahead, even if the odds suggested that neither pilot nor machine should reasonably expect to survive the next few hours. Sarah ran through her final checks with methodical precision, confirming that the extensive modifications hadn't compromised any critical systems. The aircraft felt different, heavier with maximum fuel load, subtly altered in balance and handling characteristics, stripped of familiar equipment, and loaded with specialized gear that might mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Phoenix Tower, you are cleared for takeoff. Winds 270 at 15, gusting to 22, altimeter 29906. The control tower operator's voice carried the routine professionalism that characterized normal flight operations, but Sarah could detect an underlying tension that suggested everyone on base understood this was anything but routine. Tower Phoenix, cleared for takeoff 29906. Sarah advanced the throttle smoothly, feeling the familiar surge of power as the Pegasus engine responded to her inputs. The aircraft began its takeoff roll, accelerating down the runway with the determined purpose of a machine designed to go places where other aircraft couldn't follow. The moment of rotation came sooner than expected due to the modified weight distribution, requiring Sarah to adjust her technique for the altered handling characteristics. The Harrier lifted off cleanly, climbing into the morning sky with the steady determination that had made it legendary among pilots who understood that raw performance mattered less than the ability to complete missions under impossible conditions. As Yuma disappeared beneath her wings, Sarah began the subtle course changes that would take her along a route carefully planned to avoid commercial air traffic, military training areas, and the sophisticated radar networks that monitored American airspace. The first phase of the mission required her to appear completely routine. Just another training flight heading toward designated exercise areas. But once she crossed into international airspace, everything would change. She would become a single aircraft penetrating one of the most heavily defended regions in the world, attempting a rescue mission that conventional wisdom declared impossible, betting everything on her ability to outfly, outthink, and outmaneuver military forces that had been specifically trained to prevent exactly this type of incursion. The navigation system displayed her current position and projected course, showing waypoints that would take her across vast stretches of desert, over mountain ranges that rose like geological barriers between nations, and eventually to a landing site so remote and treacherous that it existed beyond the reach of normal military operations. Each waypoint represented hours of flight time through increasingly hostile territory, with diminishing options for emergency landing or alternative courses of action. 45 minutes after takeoff, Sarah reached the first critical decision point. A course change to the northeast would take her toward the official exercise area, where she was supposed to be conducting routine training. Continuing straight ahead would commit her to the mission profile that led directly into Iranian airspace and the rescue attempt that had consumed every moment of preparation over the past few hours. She made the course change that took her away from safety and toward the unknown. The landscape below began to change as Sarah flew deeper into regions where American military presence was limited and political tensions ran high. Populated areas gave way to vast stretches of empty desert, broken by mountain ranges that rose like ancient walls between civilizations. The terrain was beautiful in its harsh emptiness, but it was also the kind of landscape where aircraft could disappear without trace, and pilots could vanish into political complications that governments preferred not to acknowledge. Sarah's radio crackled with routine air traffic control communications from distant commercial flights, the normal chatter of aviation operations continuing their predictable patterns while she flew towards something that existed completely outside those familiar boundaries. She was still technically in friendly airspace, but every mile northward took her closer to regions where her presence would be considered hostile, and her mission would be regarded as an act of war. The fuel gauges showed consumption rates exactly matching her pre-flight calculations, but the numbers served as a constant reminder that this mission operated without the safety margins that characterized normal flight operations. Every gallon of fuel was accounted for. Every mile of range was committed to specific phases of the mission profile, leaving no reserves for navigation errors or unexpected circumstances. At 2 hours into the flight, Sarah encountered the first weather system that intelligence reports had warned her to expect. Clouds began building ahead of her aircraft, towering cumulus formations that rose like atmospheric mountains above the desert floor. The weather radar painted the storm cells in shades of yellow and red that indicated turbulence severe enough to damage aircraft and threaten pilot survival. But the same weather system that posed dangers also provided opportunities for concealment. Sarah climbed toward the cloud base, using the moisture and electrical activity to mask her aircraft's radar signature from ground-based sensors that might be monitoring the area for unusual air traffic. The turbulence was severe enough to make instrument reading difficult, but not severe enough to threaten structural integrity of an aircraft designed to operate in combat environments. Inside the cloud system, visibility dropped to near zero, forcing Sarah to rely entirely on instruments for navigation and aircraft control. The Harrier bucked and rolled in the unstable air, requiring constant control inputs to maintain heading and altitude. Lightning flickered around the aircraft, creating electromagnetic interference with radio and navigation systems, but also providing electromagnetic camouflage that would make her difficult to track on radar screens. She emerged from the weather system 30 minutes later, finding herself over terrain that had become noticeably more mountainous and significantly more hostile. The peaks below rose to elevations that would challenge aircraft performance, while the valleys between them created wind patterns that could slam an unwary pilot into the ground without warning. This was the kind of landscape where experience mattered more than technology, where understanding how air moved over terrain could mean the difference between successful navigation and becoming another pilot who simply disappeared. The radio remained silent except for occasional position reports from commercial flights operating along established air routes hundreds of miles away. Sarah was now flying through airspace where military aircraft seldom ventured, where communication with ground-based controllers was impossible, and where any mechanical failure or navigation error would leave her completely isolated in hostile territory. Her secure communication system activated with an encrypted update from Colonel Hayes. Phoenix, home plate. Latest intelligence indicates Razor 4-1 is still in position at the target location. However, Iranian search activities have intensified in the surrounding area. Estimate you have less than 3 hours before enemy forces reach the extraction site. The timeline was getting tighter, adding pressure to a mission that was already operating at the edge of what was technically possible. Sarah would have to reach the target area, execute a perfect landing in impossible conditions, load 4 additional personnel onto an aircraft already at maximum weight, and escape Iranian airspace before ground forces arrive to investigate the unusual aircraft activity. Home plate Phoenix. Copy timeline update. Current position on schedule, weather as briefed, no mechanical issues. Sarah's response was professional and confident, giving no indication of the stress that came from flying alone through increasingly hostile territory toward a landing site that might prove impossible to reach. She was now less than 100 miles from Iranian airspace, flying over terrain that intelligence reports described as actively patrolled by military forces, specifically trained to intercept unauthorized aircraft. The mountains ahead rose to elevations that would force her aircraft to operate at altitudes where engine performance was reduced and maneuvering capability was limited. Weather conditions were deteriorating exactly as predicted, with wind speeds that would make vertical landing extremely hazardous. The secure radio crackled again with an update that made Sarah's blood run cold. Phoenix, home plate. SIGINT reports possible Iranian fighter activity in your target area. 2 aircraft, type unknown, conducting what appears to be search patterns. Be advised that enemy air defense posture may be higher than initially assessed. Iranian fighters meant that her mission had potentially been compromised, or that enemy forces were responding to some other intelligence indicator that had prompted increased military activity in precisely the area where she needed to conduct the extraction. Either way, it meant that what was already a dangerous mission had become significantly more deadly. Sarah checked her navigation display, confirming her position relative to the Iranian border and calculating the time remaining before she would cross into airspace where her presence would be considered an act of war. She had perhaps 20 minutes to decide whether to continue with the mission or abort, while she still had sufficient fuel to return to friendly territory. 20 minutes to choose between the safety of turning back and the moral obligation to 4 Americans who were trapped without hope of rescue through conventional means. 20 minutes to decide whether the risks of continuing outweighed the certainty that abandoning the mission meant abandoning people who had trusted their government to bring them home, regardless of the political complications. She maintained course toward the Iranian border. The terrain below had become a moonscape of jagged peaks and narrow valleys, broken by ridgelines that rose like walls between Sarah and her destination. The GPS navigation system showed her position with electronic precision, but the satellite imagery couldn't convey the reality of flying through air that was turbulent enough to threaten aircraft control at altitudes where oxygen was thin and engine performance was marginal. Sarah descended slightly, using terrain masking to reduce her radar signature while staying above the minimum altitude required for safe flight over the mountains. The aircraft responded sluggishly to control inputs, reminding her that she was operating at the edge of the flight envelope with no reserves for emergency maneuvering or unexpected obstacles. The Iranian border appeared on her navigation display as a thin line that represented the legal boundary between nations, but which in practical terms meant the difference between a training mission and an act of war. Once she crossed that line, Sarah would be flying in airspace where her presence was considered hostile, where enemy radar systems would be actively searching for aircraft like hers, and where any malfunction or navigation error could result in capture, death, or international incident. She crossed into Iranian airspace at exactly 1,347 hours, flying at 8,000 feet above terrain that rose to within a few hundred feet of her altitude. Below her, the landscape was a maze of valleys and ridgelines that would challenge the navigation skills of even experienced pilots, complicated by weather conditions that reduced visibility and created turbulence severe enough to make precise aircraft control extremely difficult. The target area was now less than 30 minutes away, assuming she could maintain course and speed through increasingly hostile territory. Somewhere ahead, 4 American Special Operations personnel were waiting for rescue that conventional military wisdom said was impossible to provide. Weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly, enemy forces were closing on their position, and time was running out for a mission that represented their only chance of survival. Sarah advanced the throttle slightly, accepting increased fuel consumption in exchange for higher speed toward the extraction site. Every minute saved in transit was a minute that might prove critical during the vertical landing sequence that would test everything she had learned about flying the Harrier in impossible conditions. The radio remained silent, but Sarah knew that silence itself was significant. No calls from Iranian air defense controllers meant her aircraft hadn't been detected by ground-based radar systems. No fighter intercept communications meant enemy aircraft weren't actively hunting for her, but it also meant she was completely alone in hostile territory, with no support and no backup if things went wrong. She was exactly where she needed to be, flying toward a landing site that existed at the very edge of what was possible, carrying the hopes of 4 Americans who had no other chance of coming home alive. The mountains of western Iran rose around Sarah's aircraft like geological fortresses, their peaks shrouded in clouds that twisted and churned in the high-altitude winds. The landscape below was a study in hostile beauty. Razor-sharp ridgelines separated by valleys so narrow they seemed like cracks in the Earth's surface. Terrain so rugged that it appeared designed specifically to defeat aircraft operations of any kind. Sarah's navigation display showed her position relative to the target coordinates, but the electronic precision of GPS waypoints couldn't capture the reality of flying through air that hammered her aircraft with turbulence violent enough to make instrument reading nearly impossible. The Harrier bucked and rolled in the unstable atmosphere, requiring constant control inputs to maintain heading and altitude through conditions that would have grounded less capable aircraft. Weather conditions were deteriorating exactly as intelligence reports had predicted, but experiencing the reality of flying through a mountain storm system was vastly different from reading meteorological briefings in an air-conditioned operations center. Wind speeds at her current altitude exceeded 40 knots, gusting unpredictably as air masses collided with the irregular terrain below. Visibility had dropped to less than 2 miles, turning navigation into a combination of electronic systems and pilot intuition. The secure communication system activated with a transmission that carried the unmistakable sound of someone operating under extreme stress. Any station, this is Razor 4-1. Emergency, emergency, emergency. American personnel in distress. Require immediate extraction. Grid coordinates 77 Alpha 446928. Sarah's pulse quickened as she heard the first direct communication from the personnel she was risking everything to rescue. The voice belonged to someone who was clearly exhausted, possibly wounded, and operating in conditions that had pushed human endurance beyond normal limits. But the transmission also confirmed that at least one member of the Special Operations Team was still alive and capable of radio communication. Razor 4-1, Phoenix. I'm inbound to your position with extraction capability. Estimate 20 minutes to your location. What's your current status? Sarah's response was calm and professional, designed to provide reassurance to people who had been trapped without hope for nearly 12 hours. The relief in the responding voice was unmistakable. Phoenix, Razor 4-1, holy shit, somebody actually sent help. We have 4 personnel, 1 serious casualty, 1 walking wounded. We're on a narrow ridge about 30 feet wide, surrounded by vertical drops. Weather's getting worse by the hour, and we can hear Iranian search teams in the valley below us. Sarah processed this information rapidly, comparing the personnel report with her aircraft's payload limitations and the technical requirements for vertical landing in confined space. 4 personnel meant she was at the absolute limit of safe operating weight, especially considering the high altitude and deteriorating weather conditions. The confined landing site meant she would have no margin for error during the approach and landing sequence. Razor 4-1, Phoenix, copy 4 personnel, medical casualties. Be advised I'm flying an AV-8B Harrier, configured for vertical landing operations. Landing site dimensions are critical. I need exact measurements of available space. The information was essential for calculating approach angles and determining whether the extraction was technically feasible under current conditions. Phoenix, we're on a shelf approximately 30 feet wide and maybe 80 feet long. There's a vertical drop on 3 sides, and the 4th side is a rock face that goes straight up about 200 feet. Winds howling through here like you wouldn't believe, and visibility's maybe 50 yards in this cloud cover. The dimensions were workable, barely, but the wind conditions and limited visibility would make the landing sequence extremely hazardous. Sarah would have to descend vertically through turbulent air into a space that provided no room for lateral correction, with weather conditions that made precise aircraft control nearly impossible. One miscalculation or unexpected wind gust would send her aircraft into the mountainside with fatal results for everyone involved. Sarah's threat warning system activated briefly, indicating possible radar contact from ground-based air defense systems. The signal was weak and intermittent, suggesting that Iranian radar operators might be detecting something in the area but weren't able to maintain consistent track on her aircraft. The mountainous terrain and adverse weather conditions were providing natural camouflage, but they were also making navigation and aircraft control significantly more challenging. Phoenix, Razor 4-1, we've got movement in the valley below us. Looks like Iranian ground forces with vehicles, maybe 800 meters south of our position. They're definitely searching for something, and they're working their way up the mountainside. The transmission added another layer of urgency to a mission that was already operating under extreme time pressure. Iranian ground forces meant that the window for extraction was closing rapidly. Once enemy personnel reached the ridge where the American team was trapped, the extraction would become impossible regardless of weather conditions or aircraft capabilities. Sarah would have to reach the landing site, execute a perfect vertical landing, load 4 people onto an aircraft already at maximum weight, and escape Iranian airspace before ground forces could bring weapons to bear. The terrain ahead was becoming increasingly treacherous, with peaks that rose to within a few hundred feet of her current altitude. Sarah descended slightly to maintain terrain clearance, accepting increased exposure to ground-based observers in exchange for safer navigation through the mountain passes. The aircraft was handling sluggishly due to the thin air and maximum fuel load, requiring larger control inputs and longer response times than normal flight operations. Weather radar showed the storm system intensifying directly over the target area, with precipitation and turbulence that would make vertical landing operations extremely hazardous. But the same weather conditions that threatened mission success were also providing concealment from Iranian air defense systems and making it difficult for ground forces to track her aircraft's approach. Sarah activated her tactical display and began studying the approach route to the extraction site. The surrounding terrain created a natural maze of ridgelines and valleys that would conceal her aircraft until the final moments of the landing sequence, but also provided limited options for emergency escape routes if the extraction attempt failed. Once she committed to the approach, she would be trapped in a narrow valley with no room for maneuvering and no alternative landing sites. Razor 4-1, Phoenix. I'm beginning my approach to your position. I need you to establish visual contact and provide wind direction and velocity at your location. Also need confirmation that the landing site is clear of obstacles and personnel. The information was critical for calculating the final approach profile and ensuring that the landing attempt didn't endanger the people she was trying to rescue. Phoenix, Razor 4-1. We're spread out around the perimeter of the landing area, winds coming from the northwest, gusting pretty strong but no consistent direction. We can hear your aircraft but can't see you yet due to cloud cover. Landing site is clear except for some loose rocks that we've been trying to move out of the way. Sarah began her descent toward the target coordinates, using GPS navigation to guide her through clouds that reduced visibility to near zero. The aircraft shook continuously in the turbulent air, making smooth control inputs nearly impossible, and forcing her to rely on instrument flying techniques in conditions that were rapidly approaching the limits of safe aircraft operation. The altimeter showed her descent through 8,500 feet, with the target landing site located at 8,000 feet above sea level. She was now flying through the same weather system that had defeated helicopter rescue attempts, experiencing firsthand the wind conditions and visibility restrictions that had made conventional extraction impossible. At 8,200 feet, Sarah broke through the cloud layer and caught her first glimpse of the extraction site. The terrain was even more forbidding than satellite imagery had suggested. A narrow ridge thrust up from the surrounding mountains like a geological accident, surrounded by drops so steep they disappeared into misty valleys far below. The landing site itself appeared as a small flat area barely visible against the mountainside, looking impossibly tiny for aircraft operations of any kind. But as Sarah studied the terrain with the experienced eye of a pilot who had learned to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles, she began to identify the features that would make the landing possible. The ridge was oriented almost perpendicular to the dominant wind direction, which would help stabilize her aircraft during the hover sequence. The surrounding peaks would create downdrafts and turbulence, but they would also provide wind breaks that might give her the few seconds of stable air needed for touchdown. Phoenix, Razor 4-1, we can see you now. You're about half a mile out, approaching from the south. Be advised the wind's really picking up, and we can see precipitation moving in from the west. The transmission carried a mixture of relief and anxiety from people who understood that rescue was possible but far from certain. Sarah could now see the 4 personnel positioned around the edges of the landing site, their positions marking the boundaries of the space available for her aircraft. The area was indeed approximately 30 feet wide, just barely adequate for the Harrier's wingspan, with no margin for lateral drift during the landing sequence. The approach would require her to descend vertically through increasingly turbulent air, maintaining perfect position over a target that was smaller than most helicopter landing zones, while fighting wind conditions that could slam her aircraft into the mountainside without warning. She would have one opportunity to get it right, because the confined space and surrounding terrain made wave-off procedures impossible once she committed to the final approach. Sarah configured her aircraft for vertical landing operations, rotating the engine nozzles to the hover position and activating the reaction control systems that would provide stability during the descent. The Harrier transformed from a conventional aircraft into a mechanical hummingbird, capable of precise positioning in three-dimensional space, but requiring constant pilot inputs to maintain control. Razor 4-1, Phoenix. Beginning final approach, clear the landing area and take positions behind cover. This is going to get interesting. Sarah's voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had performed similar operations before, but also the underlying tension that came from attempting something at the very edge of what was technically possible. The descent began smoothly, with the Harrier responding predictably to her control inputs as it settled toward the narrow ridge, but as Sarah descended below the protection of the surrounding peaks, the wind conditions became dramatically more violent, buffeting her aircraft with gusts that threatened to slam her into the mountainside or blow her completely off the landing site. At 50 feet above the target, a massive downdraft caught the aircraft and drove it toward the ridge with frightening speed. Sarah reacted instantly, adding power and adjusting the thrust vector to arrest the descent and regain control. The Harrier shuddered and bucked in the unstable air, its engines screaming at maximum power to maintain position against the wind forces trying to destroy the aircraft. At 20 feet above the landing site, Sarah could see the faces of the personnel she was risking everything to save. They were pressed against the rocks at the edges of the ridge, watching her aircraft fight for control in conditions that seemed designed to make landing impossible. Their expressions showed a mixture of hope and terror, as they witnessed an aircraft attempting something that defied conventional wisdom about what was possible in mountain flying. The final 10 feet of descent took nearly 3 minutes as Sarah fought to maintain precise position over the tiny landing area. Every gust of wind threatened to blow her aircraft into the rocks. Every downdraft tried to slam her into the ridge with enough force to destroy the Harrier and kill everyone involved. But gradually, through a combination of skill, determination, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept failure, Sarah managed to bring her aircraft into a stable hover directly over the extraction site. The moment of touchdown was almost anticlimactic after the drama of the approach. The Harrier settled onto the narrow ridge, with surprising gentleness, its landing gear finding purchase on ground that had been cleared of obstacles by 4 Americans, who understood that their lives depended on giving her aircraft every possible advantage. But as Sarah began shutting down to minimum power settings for personnel loading, her threat warning system activated with the unmistakable signature of surface-to-air missiles being activated somewhere in the valley below. Iranian air defense forces had finally detected her aircraft and were preparing to engage with weapon systems that could destroy her Harrier before she could escape with the rescued personnel. The extraction had succeeded, but the most dangerous part of the mission was just beginning. The moment Sarah's landing gear touched the rocky surface of the ridge, 4 figures emerged from their concealed positions and began moving toward the aircraft with the urgent efficiency of special operations personnel who understood that every second mattered. The threat warning system continued its ominous electronic chirping, indicating that Iranian air defense systems were actively tracking her aircraft and calculating firing solutions that would turn the Harrier into scattered wreckage across the mountainside. Staff Sergeant Mike Reaper Kowalski reached the aircraft first, moving with the peculiar combination of speed and careful precision that characterized someone operating on a leg injury that hadn't been properly treated for nearly 14 hours. His face was streaked with dirt and dried blood, his uniform torn in several places, but his eyes carried the focused intensity of someone who refused to let physical damage interfere with mission completion. "Ma'am, we've got 1 stretcher case and 3 walking wounded," Kowalski shouted over the noise of the Harrier's engines, which Sarah was keeping at minimum power to reduce heat signature while maintaining immediate takeoff capability. Sergeant Davis took shrapnel in the abdomen during the initial contact. He's stable but needs medical attention ASAP. Behind Kowalski came Corporal Jennifer Ghost Martinez, supporting Sergeant First Class Robert Davis, who was moving under his own power but clearly struggling with internal injuries that had sapped his strength and left his face pale with shock and blood loss. Davis had fashioned a makeshift pressure bandage around his midsection, but Sarah could see that blood was still seeping through the field dressing. The 4th member of the team, Specialist Tommy Prophet Chen, brought up the rear while maintaining visual surveillance of the approaches to their position. Chen carried the team's essential equipment and communications gear, but Sarah could see that he was favoring his left arm, and moving with the careful gait of someone dealing with injuries he hadn't had time to properly address. "Ma'am, we've got Iranian ground forces approximately 600 meters down the valley and closing fast," Chen reported, his voice carrying the professional calm of someone trained to deliver critical information under extreme stress. "They're moving up the ridgeline in squad-sized elements, and they've got what looks like portable air defense systems with them." Sarah's mind processed this information rapidly, calculating the time required to load personnel, execute vertical takeoff procedures at maximum gross weight, and clear the immediate area before Iranian forces could bring weapons to bear on her aircraft. The numbers were tight, but manageable if everything went perfectly and no additional complications developed. The loading process began immediately, with the 3 ambulatory personnel working together to help Davis into the aircraft's cramped passenger compartment. The Harrier hadn't been designed for personnel transport, and accommodating 4 additional people in a cockpit space meant for one pilot required careful positioning and weight distribution to maintain aircraft balance within acceptable parameters. Sarah remained in the pilot's seat, engines running, constantly monitoring the threat warning displays that showed Iranian radar systems maintaining active locks on her aircraft. The electronic warfare suite was detecting multiple search radars, fire control systems, and communication networks that painted a picture of enemy forces coordinating a response to the unusual aircraft activity in their territory. "How's our fuel situation looking, ma'am?" Kowalski asked as he helped secure Davis in the makeshift passenger area behind Sarah's seat. The question reflected the professional awareness of someone who understood that successful extraction required not just reaching the target location, but having sufficient range to return to friendly territory. "Fuel's tight but adequate for the return flight," Sarah responded, checking her gauges one more time to confirm the calculations she'd made during mission planning. "We're at maximum gross weight now, which affects our performance envelope, but we've got enough range to reach the refueling point, assuming optimal flight conditions." The assumption of optimal flight conditions was optimistic given the weather system that continued to build around them, but Sarah had learned that successful missions often depended on maintaining confidence in the face of deteriorating circumstances. Doubt was a luxury that combat pilots couldn't afford when lives depended on their ability to push aircraft and personal capabilities beyond normal operational limits. Martinez took her position in the passenger area and immediately began working on Davis's wounds with the practiced efficiency of someone trained in combat medicine. She had managed to acquire additional medical supplies from their equipment cache and was using the few minutes of relative safety to stabilize their most seriously injured team member for the flight home. "Sergeant Davis is losing blood faster than I'd like," Martinez reported, her voice carrying the controlled concern of a medic dealing with injuries that were serious but not immediately life-threatening. "He needs a real medical facility within the next few hours, but he should be stable enough for the flight if we can avoid too much maneuvering." The limitation on maneuvering was significant given the threats that Sarah knew they would face during the escape from Iranian airspace. High G turns and evasive maneuvers that might be necessary to avoid surface-to-air missiles could exacerbate Davis's internal injuries and potentially cause complications that would threaten his survival during the flight home. Chen settled into the remaining space in the passenger compartment, his equipment secured and his weapon ready for immediate use if the situation required defensive action during takeoff or the initial phases of the escape route. The confined space meant that all 4 special operations personnel were packed into an area designed for cargo rather than human passengers, but military personnel were accustomed to operating in conditions that prioritized mission success over comfort. "Ma'am, we're as ready as we're going to get back here," Chen reported, his voice indicating that the loading process had been completed as efficiently as possible under the circumstances. "Davis is secured, medical equipment is in place, and we're prepared for immediate departure." Sarah began the vertical takeoff sequence, gradually increasing power while monitoring engine parameters that would indicate whether her aircraft could generate sufficient thrust to lift maximum gross weight at the current altitude and atmospheric conditions. The Harrier's performance margins were thin at 8,000 feet elevation, and the additional weight of 4 personnel pushed the aircraft very close to the limits of safe operation. The threat warning system suddenly activated with the high-pitched tone that indicated missile launch detection. Somewhere in the valley below, Iranian air defense personnel had fired a surface-to-air missile at her aircraft, calculating that they had sufficient time to engage before she could escape the effective range of their weapons systems. Missile launch bearing 270, estimated time to impact 45 seconds, Sarah announced, her voice remaining calm despite the immediate threat to everyone aboard the aircraft. She began climbing vertically at maximum power, using the Harrier's unique capabilities to gain altitude directly upward, rather than following a conventional takeoff profile that would have kept her within range of ground-based weapons. The passenger compartment erupted in tense activity as the special operations personnel prepared for the possibility of missile impact. Martinez continued working on Davis's medical condition while the others checked their equipment and prepared for emergency procedures that might be required if the aircraft sustained damage during the escape attempt. Sarah watched the missiles approach on her threat display, calculating intercept angles and timing while maneuvering the Harrier to minimize the probability of successful engagement. The aircraft's vertical flight capabilities allowed her to execute maneuvers that conventional fixed-wing aircraft couldn't perform, but the maximum gross weight and high altitude reduced her maneuvering performance significantly. The missile passed less than 200 feet from the aircraft, its proximity fuse failing to detonate due to electronic countermeasures that had been specifically configured to defeat the guidance systems used by Iranian air defense weapons. Sarah continued climbing vertically until she reached an altitude that provided some protection from additional surface-to-air missiles, then began transitioning to forward flight for the escape route. But as she leveled off at 12,000 feet and began accelerating toward the Iranian border, her radar warning receiver detected the distinctive signature of fighter aircraft approaching from the northeast. Two aircraft, probably F-14 Tomcats from the Iranian Air Force, were climbing rapidly toward an intercept course that would bring them into weapons range within the next 10 minutes. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The situation had escalated from a challenging extraction mission to active air-to-air combat with enemy fighters that possess speed and weapons advantages over her heavily loaded Harrier. Sarah's aircraft was at maximum gross weight, operating at high altitude where performance was reduced, and configured for vertical landing operations rather than air-to-air combat. "We've got company coming," Sarah announced to her passengers, beginning evasive maneuvers that would make interception more difficult while maintaining course toward friendly airspace. Two Iranian fighters inbound from the northeast. Things are going to get interesting for the next few minutes. The Harrier's radar warning receiver painted a detailed picture of the approaching threat. Two F-14 Tomcats with Phoenix air-to-air missiles that outranged anything Sarah could have brought to the fight, even if her aircraft had been configured for combat operations. The Iranian fighters had both speed and altitude advantages, and their pilots were undoubtedly vectoring toward an intercept course that would allow engagement before she could reach the protection of friendly airspace. Sarah descended rapidly toward the valley floors, using terrain masking to break radar contact while maintaining course toward the border. The mountainous landscape that had made the extraction so dangerous now provided concealment from airborne threats, but flying at high speed through narrow valleys and deteriorating weather conditions created its own set of hazards that could prove fatal to an overloaded aircraft. The special operations personnel in the passenger compartment were experiencing the full violence of high-performance military flying for the first time, their bodies pressed against uncomfortable surfaces as Sarah maneuvered the Harrier through maneuvers that pushed both aircraft and occupants to the limits of physical tolerance. Davis's medical condition was being monitored continuously by Martinez, who was fighting her own battle against motion sickness while trying to keep their wounded team members stable. "How much further to friendly airspace?" Kowalski asked, his voice strained by the physical demands of high-G maneuvering in the confined passenger compartment. The question reflected the natural concern of someone who understood that every mile remaining represented additional opportunities for things to go catastrophically wrong. "Approximately 40 minutes to the border," Sarah responded while simultaneously monitoring multiple threats and calculating fuel consumption rates that would determine whether they could reach safety before Iranian fighters forced a confrontation that her aircraft couldn't win. "Iranian fighters are still tracking us, but the terrain is making intercept difficult for them." The F-14s were attempting to use their superior altitude and speed to position themselves for a missile engagement, but Sarah's low-altitude route through the mountain valleys was forcing them to descend into terrain that limited their radar effectiveness and reduced their tactical advantages. The Iranian pilots were skilled, but they were also operating over their own territory, where aggressive maneuvering near mountainous terrain carried significant risks. Sarah's fuel gauges showed consumption rates that were higher than planned due to the combat maneuvering and maximum power operations required for the escape route. The additional fuel burn meant that reaching the original refueling point might not be possible, requiring alternative plans that would extend their time in hostile airspace and increase exposure to additional threats. The electronic warfare suite detected multiple radar signatures from ground-based air defense systems that were attempting to track her aircraft and provide targeting information to the pursuing fighters. The combination of airborne and ground-based threats created a complex tactical environment that required continuous maneuvering to avoid engagement by weapon systems that could destroy the overloaded Harrier with a single successful hit. But as Sarah flew deeper into the maze of valleys and ridgelines that separated Iran from friendly territory, she began to see opportunities that her pursuers might not recognize. The same terrain features that made navigation difficult also provided concealment and maneuvering advantages for an aircraft that could operate at low altitude with precise control in confined spaces. The Harrier might be outmatched in terms of speed and weapons, but Sarah had spent 6 years learning to use her aircraft's unique capabilities to succeed in situations where conventional tactics would fail. She was about to discover whether those skills were adequate for bringing 4 Americans home from a mission that conventional wisdom declared impossible. The Iranian F-14 Tomcats were closing the distance with methodical precision, their pilots executing a classic pincer movement designed to force Sarah's aircraft into a position where escape would become impossible. The lead fighter was approaching from the northeast, using superior altitude to maintain radar contact despite the terrain masking that Sarah was employing. The second aircraft was positioning itself to block the most direct route to friendly airspace, creating a tactical situation where any course change would bring her within weapons range of at least one enemy fighter. Sarah descended even lower into the valley system, her altimeter showing barely 300 feet above the rocky terrain that rushed past her canopy at nearly 400 miles per hour. Flying at such low altitude in mountainous terrain required split-second reactions and absolute precision, with margin for error measured in feet rather than the miles that characterized normal high-altitude flight operations. The slightest miscalculation would result in controlled flight into terrain, killing everyone aboard instantly. The special operations personnel in the passenger compartment were experiencing the full intensity of combat flying, their bodies pressed against the aircraft's internal structure as Sarah executed maneuvers that pushed both human and mechanical systems to their operational limits. Martinez was fighting a losing battle against motion sickness while trying to monitor Davis's condition, her medical training warring with the physical demands of high-performance flight in turbulent conditions. Davis is holding steady, but his blood pressure's dropping, Martinez reported, her voice strained by the physical effort of remaining functional during violent maneuvering. I can keep him stable for maybe another hour, but he needs real medical attention soon, or we're going to have serious complications. The medical timeline added another layer of pressure to a tactical situation that was already operating at the edge of survivability. Sarah needed to evade 2 enemy fighters while maintaining course toward friendly territory, all while protecting a wounded passenger whose condition could deteriorate rapidly if the flight conditions became too severe. Her radar warning receiver suddenly painted a new threat picture as the lead F-14 achieved missile lock and prepared to engage with Phoenix air-to-air missiles that had a range advantage of nearly 50 miles. The Iranian pilot was positioning for a shot that would allow engagement while remaining outside the effective range of any defensive system Sarah's aircraft might possess. Missile launch warning, bearing 045 degrees, Sarah announced, beginning immediate evasive maneuvers that took advantage of the Harrier's unique flight characteristics. Instead of continuing straight ahead like a conventional aircraft, she executed a maneuver that was impossible for any other fixed-wing fighter. She stopped. The Harrier's thrust vectoring nozzles rotated to the hover position, killing forward airspeed almost instantly and dropping the aircraft toward the valley floor like a mechanical stone. The Iranian missile, programmed to intercept a target moving at high speed, streaked harmlessly overhead as Sarah's aircraft essentially fell out of the sky in a controlled descent that would have been suicidal in any other fighter. Currate. As the missile disappeared into the distance, Sarah rotated the nozzles back to forward flight and accelerated out of the valley, using terrain features to break radar contact while the Iranian pilots tried to understand what they had just witnessed. The maneuver had probably saved their lives, but it had also consumed enormous amounts of fuel and put additional stress on an aircraft already operating beyond its normal performance envelope. "What the hell was that?" Chen asked, his voice carrying the awe of someone who had just experienced a flight maneuver that existed outside normal aviation principles. "I didn't know aircraft could do that." Neither did the Iranian pilot, Sarah replied, checking her fuel gauges and confirming that the evasive maneuver had burned through precious reserves that she might need for the remaining flight to safety. But we're not out of this yet. They're going to be more careful with their next approach. The second F-14 was indeed adjusting its tactics, using the mountainous terrain to mask its approach, while vectoring toward a position that would force Sarah to choose between flying into a missile engagement zone or taking a route that led deeper into Iranian territory. The Iranian pilot was experienced enough to understand that the strange aircraft he was pursuing had capabilities that didn't match any known fighter profile. Sarah studied her navigation display, looking for terrain features that might provide tactical advantages in the evolving air-to-air engagement. The valley system ahead offered several options for evasive maneuvering, but each route carried its own risks and complications. The most direct path to the border led through a narrow canyon that would limit maneuvering options, while alternative routes would consume additional fuel and extend their time in hostile airspace. The weather system was continuing to deteriorate, with cloud cover that was beginning to obscure the mountain peaks and precipitation that would reduce visibility for both friendly and enemy aircraft. The adverse conditions that made flying more dangerous also provided opportunities for concealment that a skilled pilot could exploit to avoid detection and engagement. Sarah chose the canyon route, diving toward a narrow passage between towering rock walls that rose nearly 2,000 feet above the valley floor. The confined space would eliminate the altitude and speed advantages of the pursuing fighters, forcing them to operate in an environment where the Harrier's unique capabilities might provide tactical benefits. The canyon walls closed around the aircraft like geological barriers, creating a flying environment that was simultaneously spectacular and terrifying. Sarah was navigating through a space that was barely wider than her aircraft's wingspan, following a winding path that required continuous course corrections and altitude adjustments to avoid contact with the rock formations that surrounded them on all sides. Behind them, the Iranian fighters were attempting to follow, but their higher speed and larger turning radius made navigation through the confined canyon extremely hazardous. The lead F-14 was forced to climb above the canyon to avoid terrain contact, losing visual contact with Sarah's aircraft and reducing the effectiveness of radar tracking in the confined space. The passenger compartment had become a medical station where Martinez was fighting to keep Davis conscious and stable while dealing with the physical demands of flight through turbulent air in a confined space. The wounded sergeant's condition was deteriorating slowly but steadily, his body's ability to compensate for blood loss being gradually overwhelmed by the stress of combat flight conditions. "His pulse is getting weaker," Martinez reported, her voice tight with professional concern. "We need to get him to a trauma center within the next 30 minutes, or we're going to lose him." The medical emergency created additional pressure for Sarah to reach friendly territory quickly, but aggressive maneuvering to avoid the pursuing fighters could exacerbate Davis's internal injuries and potentially cause the medical complications that Martinez was working to prevent. Every tactical decision now had to balance mission survivability against patient care requirements. Sarah's threat warning system detected the second F-14 attempting to position itself at the canyon exit, where it could engage her aircraft as they emerged from the protective terrain masking. The Iranian pilot was executing a sound tactical maneuver, but it also provided Sarah with information about enemy intentions that she could use to plan her next evasive action. Van Blay. Instead of continuing straight through the canyon toward the waiting fighter, Sarah executed another maneuver that was impossible for conventional aircraft. She brought the Harrier to a hover in a slightly wider section of the canyon, then began climbing vertically between the rock walls, using the aircraft's unique capabilities to escape the canyon through a route that no pursuing fighter could follow. The vertical climb through the narrow canyon was one of the most technically challenging maneuvers Sarah had ever attempted, requiring precise control inputs to maintain position between rock walls that provided only inches of clearance on either side. The Harrier's engines screamed at maximum power to generate the thrust needed for vertical flight at high altitude with maximum payload, pushing every system to the limits of safe operation. As they cleared the canyon rim, Sarah could see the first F-14 circling above, its pilot apparently confused by her aircraft's disappearance from his radar scope. The second fighter was positioned at the canyon exit, waiting for a target that would never appear because Sarah had chosen an escape route that conventional tactical thinking said was impossible. But clearing the canyon had brought them into open airspace where the Iranian fighters could re-engage with their speed and altitude advantages. Sarah immediately began evasive maneuvering, using every terrain feature and weather condition to complicate the targeting solutions that the enemy pilots were trying to establish. The fuel situation was becoming critical, with consumption rates that exceeded the mission planning margins due to the combat maneuvering and maximum power operations required for the evasive maneuvers. Sarah calculated that they had perhaps 15 minutes of flying time remaining before fuel exhaustion would force an emergency landing in hostile territory. "How much further to the border?" Kowalski asked, his voice reflecting the natural concern of someone who could sense that their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The question was reasonable, but Sarah's navigation display showed that they were still 20 minutes away from friendly airspace at their current speed and route. "We're not going to make it to the original extraction point," Sarah said, making the decision to alter course toward an alternative landing site that might be within their remaining fuel range. "There's an emergency field about 12 minutes ahead that should be adequate for landing, assuming we can stay ahead of the fighters." The alternative landing site was a remote airstrip in neutral territory that had been identified during mission planning as a contingency option for exactly this type of situation. It wasn't ideal, but it represented the only realistic chance of getting Davis the medical attention he needed while avoiding capture by Iranian forces. The F-14s were coordinating their approach for a final engagement, using their remaining fuel and weapons to force a confrontation that would determine whether 4 Americans made it home or became casualties of a mission that had pushed the boundaries of what was possible in military aviation. Sarah could see both fighters on her radar display, closing on intercept courses that would bring them into weapons range within the next 5 minutes. But as she prepared for what might be the final phase of the most challenging mission of her career, Sarah felt no fear or uncertainty. She had trained for this moment for 6 years, learning to push the Harrier beyond its design limitations, mastering flight techniques that existed at the intersection of skill, courage, and mechanical capability. The Iranian pilots were about to discover why she had earned the call sign Phoenix, and why some aircraft, and some pilots, could accomplish the impossible when American lives hung in the balance. The final confrontation was less than 3 minutes away, with fuel running low, a wounded passenger deteriorating, and 2 enemy fighters closing for the kill. Everything Sarah had learned about flying, fighting, and refusing to accept defeat was about to be tested in the crucible of aerial combat, where the margin between success and catastrophic failure was measured in heartbeats and inches. The 2 F-14 Tomcats were converging on Sarah's position with lethal precision, their pilots executing a coordinated attack that would give her no escape route through conventional flight maneuvers. The lead fighter was approaching from directly ahead, positioning for a head-on missile engagement that would be nearly impossible to evade. The wingman was climbing to altitude, preparing to engage from above with Phoenix missiles that could reach out over 40 miles to destroy targets that thought they were safely beyond weapons range. Sarah's fuel quantity indicators showed less than 8 minutes of flying time remaining at current consumption rates, while her navigation system displayed 12 minutes to the emergency landing field. The mathematics of survival were working against them, creating a tactical situation where conventional solutions would result in fuel exhaustion, capture, or death for everyone aboard the overloaded Harrier. "Ma'am, Davis is going into shock," Martinez announced, her voice carrying the controlled urgency of a medic watching a patient's condition deteriorate beyond her ability to treat in field conditions. "His blood pressure is dropping rapidly, and I'm losing the pulse in his extremities. We need to get him to a trauma surgeon now, or we're going to lose him." The medical emergency was reaching a critical point just as the tactical situation was becoming desperate. Sarah needed to evade 2 fighters, reach a landing field that was beyond her fuel range, and do it all without subjecting her wounded passenger to G-forces that could kill him. The competing requirements seemed impossible to reconcile through any combination of skill and technology. But as Sarah studied her tactical display, she began to see a possibility that the Iranian pilots might not anticipate. The emergency landing field was located in a valley that was surrounded by peaks rising to over 10,000 feet, creating terrain conditions that would severely limit the maneuvering options for conventional fighters. The same geographical features that made the airstrip difficult to reach might also provide protection from air-to-air engagement. The lead F-14 achieved missile lock and launched 2 Phoenix missiles at maximum range, their radar signatures immediately visible on Sarah's threat warning displays. The weapons were closing at over 3 times the speed of sound, programmed to intercept her aircraft in less than 60 seconds. Conventional evasive maneuvers would be inadequate against missiles that could adjust their course to compensate for defensive maneuvering. Sarah executed the most radical defensive maneuver in her repertoire. Instead of trying to outrun or outmaneuver the incoming missiles, she brought the Harrier to a complete stop in mid-air, rotating the thrust nozzles to full hover configuration and activating the reaction control system to maintain precise position. The aircraft transitioned from high-speed flight to stationary hover in less than 10 seconds, a capability that existed nowhere else in military aviation. The Phoenix missiles, designed to intercept targets traveling at high speed, lost their target lock as Sarah's aircraft essentially disappeared from their guidance radars. The weapons continued their programmed flight path, searching for a target that was no longer where their computers expected it to be. Both missiles passed harmlessly through the airspace where the Harrier should have been, detonating uselessly against the mountainside beyond. "Impossible," came the voice of the Iranian flight leader over an unencrypted frequency, his professional composure cracking as he witnessed a maneuver that contradicted everything he understood about air-to-air combat. "No aircraft can stop like that." Sarah used the confusion to her advantage, transitioning back to forward flight and diving toward the valley floor where terrain masking would complicate any additional missile engagements. The Harrier's unique capabilities had given her a temporary reprieve, but the fundamental problems of fuel shortage and time pressure remained unchanged. The second F-14 was attempting to compensate for his flight leader's missed engagement, diving toward the valley in pursuit of an aircraft that was demonstrating flight characteristics unlike anything in his training or experience. But the Iranian pilot's aggressive descent brought him into the same mountainous terrain that was providing Sarah with concealment and tactical advantages. Sarah's radar warning receiver detected the pursuing fighter establishing a new target lock, but the pilot was now operating at low altitude in confined terrain where his aircraft's superior speed became a liability rather than an advantage. The F-14 was built for high-altitude intercept missions, not for maneuvering combat in mountain valleys where obstacles appeared without warning and altitude options were severely limited. The emergency landing field appeared ahead, a narrow strip carved into the valley floor between rock walls that rose like canyon barriers on both sides. The runway was barely long enough for emergency operations, with no margin for approach errors or extended landing rolls. Sarah would have one opportunity to execute a perfect approach and landing because the confined terrain made go-around procedures impossible. But the pursuing F-14 was still closing, its pilot determined to prevent her aircraft from reaching sanctuary regardless of the risks involved in low-altitude combat maneuvering. The Iranian fighter was less than 2 miles behind and closing rapidly, positioning for a gun engagement that would bring the aerial chase to a violent conclusion. Sarah configured the Harrier for landing approach, but instead of following conventional procedures, she used her aircraft's vertical landing capabilities to execute an approach that no other fixed-wing fighter could attempt. Rather than descending along a normal glide path that would keep her in the Iranian pilot's weapons envelope, she climbed to altitude and began a vertical descent directly onto the runway. The maneuver was operationally risky and tactically brilliant. By descending vertically, Sarah eliminated the predictable flight path that the pursuing pilot needed for a successful gun engagement. The F-14 pilot found himself trying to track a target that was moving in 3 dimensions simultaneously, descending toward a landing site through an approach profile that made weapons tracking nearly impossible. Sarah's vertical descent brought the Harrier down through turbulent air created by the surrounding mountains, requiring constant control inputs to maintain position over the narrow runway. The aircraft was at maximum gross weight, operating at high altitude, with engines that were consuming the last of their fuel reserves. Every factor was working against successful completion of the landing sequence. At 50 feet above the runway, the pursuing F-14 made one final attempt to engage, firing a burst from its 20mm cannon that sent tracer rounds streaking past Sarah's aircraft. But the Iranian pilot was shooting at a target that was stationary in hover, and his own high speed carried him past the landing site before he could achieve the precision needed for effective strafing. Sarah's landing was perfect, with the Harrier settling onto the emergency runway with the controlled precision of a helicopter operation. The engines spun down to idle power as ground personnel emerged from concealed positions, having been alerted by secure communications that an American aircraft would be arriving with wounded personnel requiring immediate medical evacuation. The F-14 pilot attempted one more attack pass, but his fuel state and the confined terrain forced him to climb out of the valley without engaging. The Iranian fighter disappeared into the distance, leaving behind an American pilot who had just demonstrated that sometimes individual skill and determination could overcome superior numbers and technology. Medical personnel reached the aircraft within minutes of touchdown, transferring Davis to a trauma team that had been standing by with equipment and supplies specifically configured for treating combat injuries. Martinez assisted with the handoff, providing medical history and treatment information that would be critical for the surgical team that would soon be fighting to save the wounded sergeant's life. "He should make it," the trauma surgeon announced after his initial assessment. "You did good work keeping him stable during the flight. Another 30 minutes and we would have lost him." Sarah remained with her aircraft as ground crews began the refueling and maintenance procedures that would prepare the Harrier for the final flight home. The mission had succeeded, but the costs were becoming clear as she reviewed fuel consumption data and system status reports. The aircraft had been pushed beyond its design limitations, operated in conditions that exceeded every normal safety margin, and subjected to combat maneuvering that had stressed components to the breaking point. Colonel Hayes arrived at the emergency landing site 6 hours later, having flown through diplomatic channels to personally debrief the mission and assess the condition of the personnel involved. Her expression carried the mixture of relief and professional satisfaction that came from witnessing subordinates accomplish missions that conventional wisdom declared impossible. "Captain Chen, I need you to understand the significance of what you accomplished today," Hayes said as they walked around the Harrier, noting the scorch marks from missile near misses and the stress fractures that showed how close the aircraft had come to mechanical failure. 4 American lives were saved because you were willing to attempt something that expert opinion said couldn't be done. The recognition was gratifying, but Sarah was already thinking about the technical lessons learned during the mission. Every aspect of the operation had revealed new capabilities and limitations of both aircraft and pilot that would be valuable for future missions. The Harrier had performed beyond expectations, but it had also shown areas where improvements could be made to extend operational envelopes even further. 3 months later, Sarah received orders transferring her to a classified program that officially didn't exist, working with aircraft modifications that pushed vertical flight capabilities into realms that had previously been considered impossible. Her mission in Iran had demonstrated that individual excellence could overcome technological limitations, but it had also identified opportunities for advancing the state-of-the-art in vertical flight operations. The 4 members of Razor 4-1 recovered completely from their injuries, returning to active duty with stories about a pilot who had reached them in a place where no aircraft should have been able to land. Davis made a full recovery, his internal injuries healing without complications thanks to the medical care he had received during the flight home. Major Richardson approached Sarah on her final day at Yuma, his expression showing the kind of professional respect that comes from witnessing genuine excellence under the most challenging conditions imaginable. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. I was wrong about the Harrier, and I was wrong about what really matters in military aviation." Sarah accepted the apology gracefully, understanding that Richardson's change of perspective represented something more significant than personal recognition. Military aviation was evolving toward greater emphasis on adaptability, versatility, and the kind of pilot skills that could make any aircraft perform beyond its apparent limitations. The official mission reports contained no mention of the Iranian extraction, no record of the air-to-air engagement, and no documentation of aircraft operations that had pushed performance envelopes beyond established limits. But within the community of pilots who flew demanding missions in challenging conditions, word spread about a pilot who had proven that expertise and determination could accomplish the impossible. The Harrier continued flying missions around the world, its ungainly appearance concealing capabilities that would surprise anyone who underestimated what could be accomplished when the right pilot was in the cockpit. And sometimes, late at night on encrypted frequencies that officially didn't exist, voices would share stories about impossible landings in impossible places, accomplished by pilots who understood that some promises were worth keeping regardless of the personal cost. Sarah Phoenix Chen had proven that individual excellence could triumph over technological limitations, that courage and skill could overcome superior numbers, and that sometimes the oldest and most underestimated tools were exactly what was needed to accomplish the impossible. Her story became legend among pilots who understood that flying was about more than just technology. It was about the human spirit that refused to accept defeat when lives hung in the balance. The mocking had stopped. The doubt had been replaced by respect. And somewhere in a classified hangar, an obsolete Harrier sat ready for the next impossible mission, waiting for a pilot skilled enough to make the impossible routine. If this story inspired you to think differently about what's possible when expertise meets determination, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe that individual excellence can overcome any obstacle. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage you can have. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers who appreciate stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it matters most. And remember, sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone else overlooks.